I found a hidden door in our house. I wasn't supposed to. It was buried behind the wallpaper in the upstairs hallway, a seam so faint it was almost invisible. But once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. And once I pushed it open, I couldn't undo what I found inside. It started with an old blueprint I found in the attic. I had been cleaning, half-heartedly shoving boxes around, when I stumbled across a rolled-up floor plan wedged behind a wooden trunk. I unrolled it out of curiosity, expecting to see the familiar outline of our house. But there was something extra. A small, rectangular room was marked behind my parents' bedroom. A room that, as far as I knew, didn't exist. No door. No window. Just a blank space hidden inside the walls. My stomach twisted. It had to be a mistake, right? An old design that was never built? Maybe part of the house had been remodeled before we moved in? That's what I told myself. But something gnawed at me. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house felt different, like it was holding its breath, waiting for me to notice what had always been there. By morning, I had made up my mind. I needed to find that room. My parents had already left for work, so I had the house to myself. I walked to the hallway where the room should have been, my pulse thrumming in my ears. I ran my hands along the wallpaper, feeling for anything, an uneven patch, a hollow sound. Then I found it. A seam. So thin, so perfectly blended into the floral pattern that I would have never noticed it if I wasn't looking for it. My fingers traced the faint outline, a strange anticipation coiling in my chest. I pressed against it. At first, nothing. Then a click. The wall shifted. My breath caught in my throat as a hidden door swung open, revealing a narrow passageway. A rush of stale air hit me, thick with dust and something else, something damp, something wrong. My flashlight beam barely cut through the darkness, revealing a steep, narrow staircase leading downward. A chill crept up my spine. I had lived in this house my entire life, and I had never once seen this passage. How long had it been here? And why had my parents never mentioned it? I hesitated, gripping the doorframe. My pulse hammered in my ears, my breath shallow. This was a bad idea. I should have just closed the door and walked away. But I didn't. I stepped forward. The floorboards groaned beneath me. The walls pressed in tight, the passage barely wide enough for me to move without brushing against them. Cobwebs clung to my arms as I descended, the musty air growing colder with every step. The deeper I went, the heavier the silence became. Something was down here. At the bottom of the stairs, I reached another door. Unlike the hidden panel upstairs, this one was solid wood, old and heavy, with a rusted metal handle. Scratches marred the lower half, long, deep gouges, as if something had desperately tried to claw its way out. A lump formed in my throat. What the hell was this? I reached out with a shaking hand, my fingers barely brushing the metal handle before I stopped. Everything in me screamed, "Don't open it." But I had come too far to turn back. I tightened my grip and twisted. The door groaned open. My flashlight beam sliced through the darkness. And what I saw inside shattered everything I thought I knew about my family. The moment my flashlight beam landed on the room, I felt something inside me tighten, a sensation so foreign that I couldn't name it at first. The space was small, barely big enough for someone to stand up straight in, and the air was thick, suffocating, as if it had been sealed for years without a single breath of fresh air passing through. The walls were made of bare concrete, rough and uneven, like a basement or a bunker, not something that should exist in a house like ours. Against the farthest wall sat a rusted metal cot, the mattress thin and stained with something I didn't want to think about, and next to it, a wooden chair with a pair of old, cracked leather straps hanging from its arms. The moment my light hit them, I felt a jolt of something close to nausea. The straps weren't just hanging loosely. They were buckled, as if someone had been restrained there, held down, left to sit in this darkness for who knew how long. I took a step forward, my foot scuffing against the dust-covered floor, sending up a small cloud that made my throat tighten. My body felt disconnected, like I was watching myself move instead of actually doing it, and my heartbeat had lodged itself somewhere in my throat, thick and heavy and uneven. I forced myself to keep looking, even though every part of me screamed to turn around and pretend I never saw any of it. There was something else near the chair, something that had been left behind on the ground, partially covered in dust and crumpled in a way that made it hard to recognize at first. A piece of fabric. No, not just fabric. A shirt. Small. Child-sized. The air in the room felt even thinner, pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe, and I found myself stepping back before I even made the conscious decision to move. I had to get out of here. I turned so fast that my flashlight flickered, the beam cutting in and out for a split second, And then I was moving up the stairs, my hand gripping the railing so hard that my knuckles ached. My heart was racing, hammering against my ribs, and by the time I reached the top, my hands were shaking so badly that I could barely push the hidden door shut behind me. The hallway outside looked normal, too normal, like nothing had changed, like I hadn't just discovered something that made my stomach twist into knots. I pressed my back against the closed door, sucking in sharp breaths, trying to ground myself, trying to think of what to do next. I needed answers. For a long moment, I just stood there, my mind spinning, my chest tight with something I couldn't name. The logical part of me wanted to come up with some kind of explanation, some reason why there was a hidden room in my house, why there were restraints in there, why there was a child's shirt left behind like a forgotten piece of something terrible. But there was no explanation that made sense, nothing that fit with the life I thought I had, nothing that fit with the people who had raised me. The thought made my stomach churn. I didn't hear the front door open at first. I was too wrapped up in my own spiraling thoughts, too caught up in the crushing weight of what I had just seen. But then my mother's voice cut through the silence, casual, unconcerned, like today was just like any other day. "We're home." The sound sent a jolt through my entire body. I stepped away from the hidden door, my movement stiff, forced, like I had forgotten how to act normal. I could hear my dad setting something down on the kitchen counter, my mom flipping through the mail like she always did when she got home from work, the ordinary sounds of life going on as if nothing had changed. Except everything had. I felt like I was standing in a stranger's house, like the people downstairs weren't really my parents, like the walls around me weren't really my home anymore. I forced myself to move, to walk down the stairs at a normal pace, even though my legs felt like they didn't belong to me. My mom was sorting through envelopes, barely glancing up as I stepped into the kitchen, my dad already halfway through drinking a glass of water, both of them so painfully normal that it made my skin crawl. For a second, I considered not saying anything, pretending I hadn't seen what was down there, pushing it all aside like a bad dream. But I couldn't. I cleared my throat, and when I spoke, my voice sounded too loud, too sharp. "Is there something you want to tell me?" My mom didn't look up right away. She flicked through another envelope, setting it aside before finally meeting my eyes, her brow furrowing slightly, her expression neutral. "About what?" For a split second, I hesitated, but then the words were out before I could stop them. The hidden door. Silence. It stretched too long, thick and unnatural, something passing through my mother's expression so fast that I almost missed it. But I didn't miss it. My dad stopped drinking, the glass still half raised to his lips, his body stiffening just slightly. My mom's lips parted like she was about to say something, but then she stopped, closing them again, her fingers tightening just slightly around the edge of the counter. I had never seen my parents at a loss for words before. Something cold trickled down my spine, the kind of fear that didn't come from ghosts or shadows but from something real, something alive. "You went in there," my father said finally, his voice quieter than I expected, but not in a surprised way. In a calculated way. My throat was dry, but I forced myself to nod. I did. Another silence. Then my mother exhaled through her nose, slow and measured, shaking her head as if I had knocked over a glass of water instead of uncovering something that shouldn't exist. When she spoke, her voice was tight, but steady. "You shouldn't have done that." I felt something in me lurch, my chest tightening, my hands clenched into fists before I even realized I was doing it. "Why?" I snapped, my voice sharp now, demanding. "What the hell is that room? Why is it there?" "What?" My voice caught, but I pushed forward. "What were you doing down there?" Neither of them spoke right away. They just looked at me, my mother's expression unreadable, my father's face blank in a way that made my stomach twist into knots. And then my mother tilted her head just slightly, watching me like she was deciding something, her eyes scanning my face before she finally said, "Sit down." I didn't sit down. I couldn't. My legs were tense, every muscle in my body coiled tight, my hands still clenched into fists at my sides. My mother's voice was calm, too calm, like she had rehearsed this moment in her head 1,000 times, like she had expected it to come eventually. My father still hadn't moved, his fingers curled loosely around his half-empty glass of water, his jaw set just enough to make my stomach twist with something too close to fear. I felt like I was standing in a room full of strangers, like the people I had trusted my entire life weren't real, like they had been playing a role this entire time, and I had only just now seen the truth. I didn't know what I expected them to say, but I knew, with absolute certainty, that whatever was about to come out of my mother's mouth would change my life forever. She exhaled, slow and measured, folding her hands neatly on the counter like she was about to explain something simple, like a math problem or how to set the oven timer. That room, she said, is not something we ever intended for you to find. No apology. No excuses. Just a simple, matter-of-fact statement, as if she were talking about a closet full of old junk instead of a hidden basement with restraints and a child's shirt left behind in the dust. My pulse pounded against my skull, my breathing shallow, my throat tight. I figured that out on my own, I said, my voice sharp, pushing through the weight pressing down on my chest. What I don't understand is why it exists in the first place. Why is there a secret room in our house? Who used it? Who? My voice caught, but I forced the words out. Who was in there? My father finally set his glass down, the sound of it meeting the counter far too loud in the heavy silence. He didn't look at me. His eyes were focused on some invisible point in the distance, his lips pressed into a thin line. My mother, however, was looking directly at me, watching me the way someone watches a burning fire, assessing the damage, calculating whether or not it's worth the effort to put it out or let it consume everything. You need to calm down, she said, her voice still even, controlled. I let out a sharp laugh, the sound jagged, unnatural, like it didn't belong to me. Calm down? You want me to calm down? I just found out my family has been keeping a hidden room in our house like some kind of goddamn horror movie, and you think I should calm down? My voice cracked, my hand shaking, and for a moment, I thought I might actually throw up. My father finally turned his head, his expression unreadable. It's not what you think, he said. I barked out another humorless laugh, shaking my head. Then tell me what it is, because I'm having a hard time coming up with an innocent explanation for what the hell I just saw. Neither of them spoke right away, and I could feel something inside me unraveling, breaking apart, the foundation of everything I thought I knew about my family crumbling beneath my feet. I had always believed my parents were normal. Strict, maybe. Private, definitely. But not this. Not this. After a long pause, my mother finally spoke again. You were never supposed to know, she said, softer this time, but no less firm. We took care of it. It's in the past. The past. That was when it hit me. Whatever had happened in that room, whatever had been done down there, wasn't happening now. It had already happened. And my parents had buried it, hidden it away, sealed it behind a door they assumed would never be opened again. I took a step back, my stomach churning. Who? I whispered. Who was down there? My father's expression darkened. It's not important. Not important. My breath came in short, uneven bursts, my chest tightening, my head spinning. They weren't going to tell me. They were going to sit there, calmly, coldly, and refuse to give me answers, refuse to acknowledge the weight of what they had done, refuse to admit that the people I had trusted my entire life weren't just keeping secrets, but hiding something monstrous. I turned on my heel and walked toward the front door. My mother's voice followed me, sharper now, her control slipping for the first time. Where do you think you're going? I didn't stop. My fingers curled around the doorknob, yanking it open so hard it rattled against the frame. To find someone who will actually tell me the truth. I stepped outside and slammed the door behind me. I didn't have a plan. I didn't even know where I was going. My thoughts were a mess, tangled and fraying at the edges, my heartbeat erratic, my skin crawling with the knowledge that I couldn't trust the two people who had raised me. I pulled out my phone, my hand still shaking, my brain cycling through every person I knew, every possible name that might be able to give me something, anything, that could make sense of what I had just uncovered. And then I remembered. My uncle. He had always been distant, always kept to himself, always seemed uneasy around my parents, like he knew something he wasn't supposed to. I hadn't seen him in years, but I still had his number, buried in my contacts, untouched since the last time I had sent him a half-hearted holiday message out of obligation. I dialed before I could overthink it. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then, just when I thought it would go to voicemail, a voice answered. Hello. I swallowed hard, gripping the phone tighter. Uncle Mark. A pause. Then, warily, yeah. Who is this? It's me. My voice wavered slightly. I need to ask you something. It's about Mom and Dad. It's about the house. There was another long pause, but this one wasn't confusion. It was understanding. A deep, exhausted kind of understanding, like he had been waiting for this call. When he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter. You found it, didn't you? My breath caught in my throat. The world around me felt like it had tilted, like gravity had shifted, like the ground beneath me was no longer steady. He already knew. He knew. I tightened my grip on the phone, my voice barely above a whisper. Tell me the truth. There was a sigh on the other end, tired and resigned. Meet me in an hour. We'll talk." The line went dead. I stood there, phone still pressed to my ear, my body frozen, my mind racing. And for the first time since opening that door, I realized the truth was going to be far worse than I had imagined. I didn't go back inside the house. I stood on the porch for a while, staring at my phone, my heartbeat loud in my ears, my mind racing through 1,000 thoughts that I couldn't untangle fast enough. My uncle had known about the room. He hadn't asked what I meant. He hadn't sounded surprised. That could only mean one thing. He had known all along. My parents had kept something buried, something I was never supposed to find, and he had been aware of it but had never said a word. I wanted to be angry at him, but I couldn't be. Not yet. Not until I knew exactly what I was dealing with. I took a deep breath and forced myself to move, to get off the porch, to start walking toward my car like I wasn't about to throw up from the sick, twisting feeling in my stomach. My hands shook as I got in and started the engine, gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The drive to my uncle's place felt longer than it should have. Every stoplight, every slow turn, every car in front of me that took too long to switch lanes only made the tension worse. I kept glancing at my phone at the time, at the last call in my history, as if I needed to remind myself that he had actually answered, that he had agreed to meet, that I wasn't imagining all of this. The farther I got from my house, the harder it became to push away the thought that maybe I should turn around, that maybe there was a reason my parents had never told me, that maybe I didn't actually want to know. But it was too late for that. I had already opened the door. I had already seen what was inside. There was no coming back from that. When I pulled up in front of my uncle's house, he was already outside, standing near the edge of the driveway, arms crossed over his chest. He looked older than I remembered, more tired, more worn down, his posture stiff in a way that told me he had been dreading this. For a moment, neither of us moved. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, and he stood there, watching me, like he was waiting for me to make the first move. Finally, I forced myself to open the door and step out, my legs unsteady beneath me. "You found the room," he said. It wasn't a question. I swallowed hard, nodding. I did. His expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes, something I couldn't quite read, something that made my stomach twist even tighter. He exhaled slowly, glancing away for a brief second before looking back at me. "I was wondering if you ever would." The way he said it, like this had been inevitable, like he had known for years that this moment would come, sent a cold shiver through me. I clenched my fists at my sides, trying to steady my breathing, trying to keep my voice level. "What the hell is that room?" He hesitated. Then he gestured toward the house. "Come inside." I didn't want to. Every instinct told me to stay outside, to keep my distance, to demand answers right here, right now, but I forced myself to follow him. The inside of his house was dim, quiet, filled with the faint scent of old books and coffee. He walked past the living room, into the kitchen, and I stayed just behind him, feeling like a stranger, feeling like a part of me had already left my own life behind. He pulled out a chair and sat down, rubbing a hand over his face before finally meeting my gaze again. "I need you to understand something before I tell you this," he said, his voice heavier than I had ever heard it. "What you found, it's not a simple story. And once I tell you, there's no undoing it. Are you sure you want to know?" The question made me want to scream. Of course, I wanted to know. I had already been pulled into this, already seen enough to know that whatever my parents were hiding wasn't something small, wasn't something that could be brushed aside. I had seen the chair. I had seen the straps. I had seen the child's shirt. The thought of walking away without answers made my skin crawl. I nodded. "Tell me everything." For a moment, he didn't speak. He just sat there, watching me, measuring something in his mind, deciding how much to say, how much to hold back. Then, finally, he exhaled, his shoulders slumping slightly. "There was someone else before you," he said. The words sent a jolt through me, my entire body going rigid. "What?" He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his hands clasped together. "Before you were born, there was another child. Your parents never told you because, to them, he never existed." My head was spinning. "What are you talking about?" He ran a hand through his graying hair, his jaw tightening. "His name was Daniel. He was your brother." The air in my lungs turned to stone. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. A brother. I had a brother. Someone who had been erased, someone who had been buried in the silence of my parents' carefully constructed life. I felt sick. They adopted him when he was 3, my uncle continued, his voice quieter now, like he was dragging up something he had tried to forget. He was quiet, shy. A good kid. But there was something wrong in that house. Something I didn't see until it was too late. I forced myself to speak. What happened to him? My uncle's expression darkened. One day, he was gone. I stared at him, my pulse hammering against my ribs. Gone. My uncle nodded. Your parents told everyone he had been sent back to foster care. That it hadn't worked out. That he had problems they couldn't handle. But I never believed them. He looked at me, and there was something raw in his eyes, something that sent another wave of nausea through me. I went to that house after he disappeared. I searched for answers. But they told me to leave it alone. The room. The hidden room. The straps on the chair. The child's shirt. Oh, God. I shoved back from the table, my chair scraping against the floor, my breath coming too fast. My uncle didn't stop me, didn't try to calm me down, just watched as I struggled to process what I had just heard. They did something to him, I whispered. He didn't answer. Because he didn't have to. I couldn't stay in that house any longer. The air felt suffocating, pressing down on me with the weight of something I couldn't name, something that had been buried long before I was born but was now clawing its way back to the surface. My uncle didn't stop me when I stood, didn't say anything when I grabbed my keys and turned toward the door. I think he knew there was nothing left to say. Nothing he could tell me that would make this any easier to process. My parents had a son before me, a child who had vanished without a trace, a child whose existence had been erased so completely that I had never even known his name until now. Daniel. That name was going to haunt me for the rest of my life. The drive home was a blur. I barely remembered getting into the car, barely registered the turns, the streets, the familiar landmarks that I had passed 1,000 times before but now felt foreign. My hands were tied on the steering wheel, my knuckles aching from the pressure, my mind spinning with every possible explanation, every theory, every horrifying thought that I couldn't shake. What had they done? Where had he gone? Why had they never spoken about him? There was no answer that made sense, nothing that didn't lead to a truth too terrible to fully accept. The hidden room, the restraints, the discarded child's shirt. I didn't know how to put the pieces together, but I knew one thing for certain. My parents weren't who I thought they were. By the time I pulled into the driveway, my entire body felt numb. The house looked the same as it always had, quiet and still, the porch light glowing softly against the darkening sky. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the front door, trying to convince myself to go inside, trying to figure out what I was going to say, how I was going to confront them. But the longer I sat there, the more I realized that there was nothing I could ask that would give me the answer I needed. They weren't going to tell me the truth. They had already buried it once. They weren't going to unearth it now just because I had found the door they never meant for me to see. I forced myself out of the car, my legs stiff, my movement slow, like my body was resisting every step toward the house. The moment I stepped inside, I knew they had been waiting for me. My mother was standing in the living room, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. My father was sitting on the couch, his hands resting on his knees, staring at the floor like he was trying to avoid looking at me. They didn't ask where I had been. They didn't demand an explanation. They already knew. You spoke to Mark, my mother said, her voice quiet but firm. I didn't answer right away. I just closed the door behind me, letting the silence stretch between us, watching them the way they were watching me, waiting to see who would break first. My father still wasn't looking at me, his fingers twitching slightly against his leg, a nervous habit I had never seen before. My mother, though, she didn't look nervous. She looked like she was preparing for a conversation she had spent years rehearsing in her head. Daniel, I said finally, and the way her face tensed, the way her entire body seemed to freeze for just a split second, told me everything I needed to know. She took a slow breath, her fingers tightening around her arms. Mark shouldn't have told you that. I felt my jaw clench, anger bubbling beneath the surface, not just at her, not just at my father, but at the sheer audacity of that response. That's what you have to say? That he shouldn't have told me? Not that it isn't true? Not that I'm wrong. She didn't speak right away. She just glanced at my father, something passing between them that I couldn't quite read, something unspoken but heavy. Then, finally, my father lifted his head, looking at me for the first time since I had walked through the door. His expression was tired, worn down, like the weight of this secret had been sitting on his shoulders for years, dragging him down inch by inch. He was sick, my father said. The words didn't hit the way I thought they would. I had been bracing for something worse, something violent, something unspeakable, but somehow, this was just as bad. Because it wasn't an answer. It wasn't an explanation. It was just another excuse, another attempt to bury the truth beneath something vague and meaningless. I swallowed hard, my hands curling into fists. What does that mean? My mother sighed, closing her eyes for a moment before opening them again, something unreadable settling in her gaze. Daniel had issues. He wasn't like you. He wasn't like other kids. He would scream for hours, hit himself, refuse to eat. She stopped, her lips pressing together, as if she was choosing her next words carefully. We tried to help him. We tried everything. But nothing worked. I felt a cold chill creep down my spine. So what did you do? Neither of them answered. And that silence told me more than anything they could have said. I felt my stomach twist, my entire body recoiling from the realization, from the truth that was pressing itself into my skull, demanding to be acknowledged. You kept him down there, I whispered, barely recognizing my own voice. You locked him in that room. My father exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face, looking more exhausted than I had ever seen him. We didn't have a choice. I let out a sharp, hollow laugh, shaking my head. There's always a choice. My mother's expression hardened. You don't understand, she said sharply. You have no idea what it was like. You weren't there. You didn't hear the things he said, the way she stopped herself, inhaling deeply, regaining control of her voice. We did what we had to do. I stared at them, at these people who had raised me, who had loved me, who had built a life around a secret so dark that I could barely comprehend it. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to make them admit to what they had done in clear, undeniable terms, but I already knew the truth. They had locked a child in that room. My brother. And then, one day, he was gone. I didn't ask what had happened to him. I didn't need to. I turned away from them, stepping back toward the door, my breath shaky, my pulse pounding against my skull. My mother called my name, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I opened the door, stepped outside, let the cool air hit my face, but it didn't make me feel any less sick. My parents had built their lives on a lie, and I had been living in it my entire life without ever realizing. I walked to my car, got in, and drove without knowing where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay there anymore.